OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Time Energy, Why You Have No Time or Energy by David McKerracher. And this is being released by Theory Underground Publishing. Theory Underground is an amazing website, YouTube channel with an incredible amount of resources and cutting-edge thinking on some of the most important issues today. I highly suggest Theory Underground. I've learned a great deal from them and enjoyed their work quite a lot. And David has released a book that forces a problem upon me, and that problem is that I have dog-eared about every single page. There are thoughts and ideas everywhere that make it difficult to review the book because I feel like I should just give you an audiobook and read it to you. It is magnificent. I've written quite a number of thoughts and reflections that helps me bring some pieces together on topics such as leisure, the relation between time and energy, which is central, obviously, to David's work here, and how we really shouldn't think about free time without also thinking about the state of energy we have in that time. And this is why David really wants to bring together time energy as a single thing. And what's really critical here is that he's bringing a Heideggerian lens by which we need to existentially approach time and think of it as what structures our experience in the world. And if we don't have control over how our experience of time is structured, our subjective time or personal time, then we're really not going to have much control over our lives. Right there, though, there's a whole chapter, there's a lovely reflection in the book on how the phrase subjective time, since we think subjective doesn't exist, we only value the objective. When you start talking about a defense of subjective time, you're seen as defending something that doesn't matter, so it's silly. So there's all these little tricks and moves in our language that make it very difficult for us to preserve and have time energy. And without time energy, I think David makes a very compelling case that you basically can't have democracy, you can't have freedom, you can't have a functioning civil order. The stakes are very high. David starts the book with this reflection about how we're working harder than ever. Far from the 15-hour workday that Mr. Keynes said awaited us, which David writes on also in the book, we actually find ourselves working harder than ever. Why? What is going on? Well, it's because a very structure of experience doesn't allow us to have leisure. And then basically to hide that loss of leisure, or to hide the feeling that we don't have any ownership over our own lives, or we're not able to do those passion projects we always want to do because we don't have time energy, we just engage in further and further labor, further and further work. I do think there's also a problem now where in the past, if your task was to fill a truck, well, when the truck was filled with boxes, there wasn't any more work you could do. So the limits of reality itself put bounds on you. But when your work is, say, digital or emails or meetings, you can always do another email before bed. You can always do another meeting or whatever. And aren't you a hard worker? You shouldn't be lazy, right? And so then what ends up happening is because facticity itself doesn't place limits on labor so much, we find ourselves working forever. But there's a lot more that needs to be said on the case, and David lays that out in his book. And it's important to realize that time energy is not just time and energy massed together, but exists prior to the compartmentalization of both. He says that on page 1. I think it's a very important point. The problem with the phrase time energy is we might think we're saying time and energy. But really what David is suggesting to us is that we can't meaningfully think about time and we can't meaningfully think about energy with them as two sides of the same coin. It's kind of like I've described Hegel's absolute idealism as a dialectic monism, a single substance that is nevertheless doubly informing one another. There's this kind of tension. We can look at time energy almost like a kind of dialectical monism. And you see, when we think merely of one or the other, then a problem that can happen with that is, say, when you're off work and you have time, if you don't have energy, well, it's your fault. You see, if you separate time and energy, then responsibility can fall on the working class for not having energy when they have time. But if time and energy are bound together and you're given time where you don't have energy, then you're not given time energy. You're just given time. So you're given something that's existentially different and socially different, and it doesn't have the same value. And so we need to think about if we're not given time energy, we're really not even given time in the fullest sense. We're given something else. We're just given sequence, perhaps. I'm tempted to bring in, I think it's, Bergson has these distinctions with things like sequence and duration. And there's a whole tradition of a deeper sense of time, which would have a lot to do with leisure, kairos. I could think of various religions and theologies. And what David is basically suggesting is if the working class is given time, but they're not given time energy, which is to say if they're given time off but not leisure, then we have something deeply wrong with the structure of our socioeconomic order. And I think he is 100% correct. And what this is all getting at as well is there's a lot of push today for shortened work hours, more free time. But you see, without the concept of time and energy, slightly shortened work days or weeks will not make the difference for reasons he gets into, and this is on page 3. So this is not merely about quitting our job or having more time. What we need is the capacity to have a different existential experience of time. And the argument is that modern life is structured in a way to make us incapable of this. I've talked in other places and other writings about the Nietzschean child, the absolute knower, the delusive individual, intrinsic motivation. I like to talk about intrinsic motivation. And what we could say is that there's something about modern life that removes from us the capacity to have intrinsic motivation. I would associate that with time energy. I would be curious what David would think about that. There are many languages, and there's something about time energy that does make me think about intrinsic motivation, because that makes me think about... there is something about time energy that makes me think about intrinsic motivation, because intrinsic motivation is when you have the energy in a moment of time to bring it fullness. You're your own mover, your own self-turning wheel. And so if there's something about modern life that removes intrinsic motivation, then when we're off from work, where we don't have any extrinsic stimulus, the system isn't going to stimulate us to do anything, and so we have a garbage time, is a phrase that is used in the book. And time energy, on page 2, time energy is reliable, reusable, and routinely available large blocks of energy-infused time throughout the week. So if we're going to have time energy, we need something like that, which you could associate with leisure. It's just difficult. Or scole is a term. Bildung, there are many ways to language it that he'll get into in the book. It's hard to use the term leisure because people hear that and think lazy or laid back, when leisure is more about a deeper inhabitance of time, as Joseph Piper describes, and then Limburg at the Stoa, and so on and so forth. From page 4, I like this paragraph. Exhausted, you need to recoup, even if you have a sudden burst of inspiration to write something epic or learn the violin. Too bad. That requires the kind of time that can be repeated with energy. But you have to go back to work, and it will be weeks before you are feeling this way again. Weeks until you are able to sacrifice the better part of a day to learn or practice something challenging and new. I think this is exactly right. There's something about the very fact that you have to go back to work that then kind of robs you of the energy to try today, and you don't really get large chunks of time. Maybe you get you get 1 week off the entire year, and it takes about 4 days to get relaxed, and then it's time to go home. So there's something problematic. I think also David brings in some personal elements where when we don't understand time energy, then when, say, parents are exhausted or kids see their parents exhausted, they can think it's evidence that the parents don't have time for the kids. The concept of time energy might help families understand, especially working class families, understand one another better, because you can just say, well, no, it's because the parents simply don't have time energy. So I think that's very important. He'll talk about energy without time, time without energy on page 7. And he's also going to make the point, I really appreciate that, traditional grand narratives, communism and capitalism, really won't help us here, because no matter what system you have, without time energy, it's not going to matter, really. That doesn't mean there aren't better systems, worse systems. It makes me think of Lepotko, who are like in the Breakdown of Nations, who say, right or left, it doesn't matter. If the system's too big, it breaks down. So we have to think in terms of size and scale, and I really like that. So I think what David is putting his finger on is that we spend way too much time thinking about the ideological system without an examination of the underlying existential structure that organizes us a certain way, regardless the system we are in. And if we don't regain time energy, communism, capitalism, socialism, choose your own adventure, it doesn't matter. It's not going to matter. I really like in chapter 2 when he makes this point, if you are considered gifted today, that means you have been cursed. I completely agree. That's just so well put. This is a great chapter. He talks about achievement junkies, and I think that's right. Like, you know, if you're gifted, you don't want to waste your talents, and then the very way, you know, you're told not to waste your talents, and the way you don't do that is by plugging into a system that destroys your time energy. I think that's exactly right. And then, you know, if you have a existential breakdown, you stop, and if you ever try to work less, that's evidence you're lazy. And so you need to work harder, and so you work harder, but you work harder in a way that removes time energy, and the situation gets worse and worse and worse. And I really also appreciate this way of thinking about time energy, because there's a lot of emphasis today on meaning, the meaning crisis, vervaeke, and I see validity to that language. I see problems with that language. You know, we always have meaning, right? You know, it's impossible not to have meaning. If you don't have meaning, you have meaning. At the same time, I understand vervaeke is talking about like an organizing principle of reality, and there's always limits to language. But time energy I like because it's getting at, it has a socio-economic association, like it's sociological and economic. We're talking time energy. And it also brings to mind what I think is the fundamental dialectic of value creation between energy and creativity, Dietrich McCloskey and Vikhoff Smil. And I think time energy is a personal existential description, which I've not seen anywhere except in this book, that describes the experience of the working class. And I think what we see is a time energy crisis. There is. And again, that can be meant by the meaning crisis, but meaning can have a very lofty metaphysical aura to it, while time energy is kind of down in the nitty-gritty of socioeconomics. And I think that's what we really need to look clearly at. I also like how he points out time energy is existential, not reducible to physics, chemistry, so on and so forth. I think that's very important. We really need an existential understanding of time, because if we don't, then we're not going to understand that there are different kinds of experiences of time. Not all experiences of time are equal. Just because you have more time does not mean you have more quality time. But that gets us into quality. You could talk about the tyranny of quantity over quality that one individual speaks of. I'm now tempted to get into, you know, Bergson's critique of Einstein, that Einstein was not aware of his implicit metaphysics. But more can be said. And it's also like, the other thing is, if everyone's like, their experience of reality is relative or subjective, then it doesn't matter, because that's just relative. So if you're tired, well, if you're tired, you're tired. It can't be evidence of a structural problem, because you're not objective. And so that very split between the subjective and objective, as I mentioned before, comes to defend the system. And David, I think, puts his finger on that very well. David then does a great job of going through the history of Western thought on leisure, and shows how most conceptions of leisure require slave labor of some form. I believe that's in a working class, and that's true. And the reason why that's important is because if we're going to talk about leisure at scale, leisure for many people, then we have to think a problem that has not been addressed. We really have not figured out how to engage in leisure at scale. And I think the consequences, if we don't figure out how to do that, are just going to get more and more dire, and David makes that case as well. And I think also, like, what's so interesting is that in the past, self-control meant freedom. David talks about this on 23. And you see today, freedom now is freedom from economic necessity. Like, you don't need anything, you have money, but here's the problem. That means you can only be free by plugging into the economic system that removes from you time energy. So you're free by plugging into that which removes freedom of self-control. So there's a very important paradox that we need to examine there that's very, very problematic. And as the book progresses, David continues to remind us of a key question, which is, how can we expect democracy, society, social capital, any of these things to be possible if the average person doesn't have time energy? If they don't have the time energy to research topics for themselves, to intellectually grow in a manner to handle great political discussion, all of these things become impossible. How can we think of ways? How can we have the energy to engage in community cookouts? You even say. I mean, how do people even have the time to engage in cookouts or Lions Club or bowling clubs? All the stuff Robert Putnam talks about. How can we really expect people to be able to do these things without time, energy? Probably not. But then again, the other issue though is if people don't have time, energy, they probably can't stand up or protest power or stand against manipulation or control. So there might be a incentive for ruling powers to create a structure that removes time, energy. David will also talk about Thomas Jefferson and Karl Marx, and this vision both had for a society of leisure. Now, both of them did not live up to those ideals perfectly, but the point is that there's this kind of historical tradition. There's this tradition of thinkers who talk about leisure as the basis of freedom that makes possible a free society. A free society is not one where there are laws. We now today think about freedom purely in terms of law. There's no law that says you can't assemble. There's no law that says you can't practice your religion, therefore you are free. It's not really freedom. This is just very basic. Legal freedom is very basic. Christopher Hitchens has a line where he says, if you have the freedom to speak, but you don't feel like you can speak freely, it's not going to matter. And I think it applies the same to time, energy. If no one's making free time illegal, if no one's forcing you to be a slave, but you don't have any time, energy to engage in leisure, then it's not going to matter if no one is forcing you to be a slave or something like that. So it's that critical move here that even if we have the possibility of leisure, even if you have a law that makes it possible to have free speech, if you don't have time, energy, it's not going to matter, in the same way that if you don't feel like you can speak freely, then it's not going to matter. And I think that's just very important. Chapter 6, being in the world, where he's going to explore the existential dimensions of time, I think is really valuable. And it should be noted that David alludes to a larger philosophical work that time, energy is pointing to, called Energy and Time, that I think is just going to be a incredible work. He talks about it at the end, that he's gathering notes and going through the whole gambit of thinkers of whom shed light on the subject of energy and time. And I think that's unbelievable, and I'm quite thrilled that he is looking at that project and working on that project. He talks about schooling, what schooling does to time, energy, and I couldn't agree more. I think schooling has been a disaster for leisure. I'll often talk about how school, Neil Postman talked about school as a trivia game, and you're basically led to believe that if you're good at trivia, if you have answers to the random questions, that you're intelligent. So being educated is not about experiencing and honoring leisure, it's about being good at trivia, which basically means you jump through the hoop when you're told, and you can do it quickest, and so then it becomes those best at participation in the system. I think the stuff on schooling is magnificent. He's going to talk about time, energy, fragility versus the concept of white fragility, and what he describes in this chapter 8, I've seen for myself. I completely agree that most working class people, what they get irritated by when they're told about white privilege is that they're told that they must believe it, or they're a racist, but they're not given the time, energy by which to research and think through the subject themselves. And so it's more of a time, energy fragility. And I think that applies to many issues in general. You can think of any of these big global topics, and people are just told what they must think, and if they don't think that way, there's something wrong with them. And so it's more of a time, energy fragility. So I think all of that is really good. I think he's correct that then basically in chapter 9, he's going to talk about how when we don't have time, energy, we try to make up for it by enjoying our lack of time, energy, jouissance. He mentions some of the things of Michael Downs, who does extraordinary work on Zizek, and how that can help us think through the loss of time, energy. And again, like I mentioned, I find myself basically having to recite to you the entire book, and there's a lot more, and it's amazing, and you need to pick up a copy right now. It's really well written. It's very clear. I think it is also, I really like also in chapter 13, where he describes a very important book, A Distinction by Pierre Bourdieu. And that book is really interesting because it goes to show why you had these complicated systems of etiquette in the past and how they functioned as social signaling. And what David points out is that the concept of coolness today is kind of caught between competing values, which is on the one hand, you want to seem gifted, but on the other hand, you want to be seen as working hard. But here's a problem. If you're gifted, you shouldn't have to work hard. And if you're working hard, that signals you're not gifted. So how do you maneuver doing both? Well, in Pierre's book, he points to how structures of etiquette and taste allowed people in positions of the upper class to carry out functions of paradoxical, of signaling, or signal in ways that would avoid these paradoxes in a manner that didn't make them become pathological, because they were achieved by simply following the rules of taste. But today, the subject has to figure out how to navigate themselves on their own when it's not clear how you do it, and it seems contradictory, so the subject becomes pathological, and he examines the concept of coolness as kind of the residue of previous cultural habits, and habitas is a term Pierre makes. There's also a lovely reflection on Keynes, on why Keynes was wrong. There's some points we need to take seriously regarding Nietzsche. There's also a wonderful examination of the importance of recognition and why recognition matters to people. It makes me think of Thymos with the great Raymond Raymond K. Hessel, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with him. And the book is great. You really need to pick it up. Go buy a copy. I really enjoyed it. I really think that David has done a great job. Theory Underground is doing great work. I highly suggest picking up a copy, and if you do pick up a copy, be sure to leave a review. I think that's very important, and I think it's very important on into this new scene that is developing for people to do that sort of thing. And I don't think it will be difficult to leave a review, because the book is excellent, and it will be very easy to review, and it will be very easy to praise it, because the book is praiseworthy, because it is excellent, and it brings into focus and provides an intellectual framework to understand a very real problem. And David, by writing this, has certainly contributed to the scene, the new intellectual philosophical scene that is developing, as he describes in his fantastic Science of Logic presentation at Philosophy Portal. So for more by David, please see Theory Underground, please see his YouTube channel, his website, and please check out his book, and be sure to purchase it, and be sure to check out his future works as well.